My name is Clarence Edward Monroe. I'm 81 years old and I live alone in the house I built with my own two hands back in 1972 on a quiet, tree-lined street in Des Moines, Iowa. I was a schoolteacher for over 40 years, American history mostly. My students used to call me Mr. Monroe, with the kind of distant respect that disappears the moment you retire. My wife, Loretta, passed away 6 years ago in her sleep. It was a soft death, the kind every man wishes for, and yet it shattered my world in a way I hadn't anticipated. She was the still point in my spinning life, the compass that kept me steady. After she was gone, the house fell silent. Not the kind of silence that soothes, but the kind that presses in from the corners like dust. I started talking to her photograph every morning over coffee. It became my ritual. I brew a pot the way she liked it, dark, with a pinch of cinnamon, and I sit at the kitchen table, her photo propped beside the sugar jar, and I tell her what the weather's doing, how my knees are holding up, which birds came to the feeder. There are days when I can almost hear her hum along to the radio or fuss at me for forgetting my pills. But those days are fewer now. Time stretches, not in the grand romantic sense of epics and legacies, but in the slow, gray sag of days that all look the same. I don't leave the house much anymore. The grocery store once a week, the pharmacy, the hardware shop when something needs mending, which is often since this house, like me, is old and stubborn. I have one neighbor I talk to occasionally, a widower named Paul, who mostly complains about his daughter-in-law and cable prices. The rest of the time, it's just me, the dog-eared books in the den, the garden I try to keep alive, and the memories that show up uninvited. My son Richard and his wife Lindsay live just 25 minutes away, but I rarely see them. They say they're busy with work, with the girls' soccer games and school fundraisers. I believe them in part. But I also know the other part, the one they won't say aloud, that I make them uncomfortable. That I'm old now, and slow, and maybe a little sharp around the edges. Lindsay once told me, in that chirpy way she has, that it's just too much emotional energy to visit sometimes. Richard, my only child, was never an expressive boy. Even when he was little, he didn't want bedtime stories or hugs. Loretta used to say he was born serious. Still, I raised him with honesty, with a roof over his head and food on the table, and an education he could build a life on. He became a real estate agent, a successful one, if you believe the brochures he leaves in my mailbox. Monroe Homes, integrity, trust, family. I never asked him for money, never once leaned on him after Loretta passed. I have savings, enough to keep the house afloat, enough for a modest funeral when my time comes. I even prepaid my cremation last year just to spare anyone the trouble. I thought I had done everything right. I stayed out of the way. I kept my independence. I didn't make demands. And still, lately, I've begun to feel the tremors of something cold underneath the surface. A distance. A recalibration. They started calling more often, but always with a purpose, asking about my will. About the house. Dad, are you sure you're comfortable with all the paperwork the way it is? Have you thought about simplifying things? You know, with probate laws and all, sometimes it's smarter to transfer property before anything happens. The language was clinical, but the implication was clear. They weren't concerned about my comfort. They were thinking about what happens after I'm gone. Or, maybe, if I'm being honest, they were thinking about what happens if they decide I'm already not fit to manage my life. The thing is, I know I forget words sometimes. I know I shuffle a little slower. But I am not gone. Not yet. I am still here, thinking, reading, remembering. Loretta used to say that the greatest cruelty of age isn't pain or loss, it's invisibility. And she was right. The older you get, the more people look through you. They think they're being kind when they talk slower, louder, with that tone you use for pets and children. But I hear it. I hear the edge in their voices when I ask for something twice. I see the look Richard gives Lindsay when I talk about how things used to be. The sigh, the impatience, the readiness to move on. And now, after months of silence, Richard and Lindsay suddenly want to talk, face to face. They're coming over this Saturday with some documents they think I should look at. "It's nothing urgent, Dad," he said over the phone. "Just something to help all of us feel a little more secure." I asked him if it was about the house. He laughed too quickly. "Don't worry," he said. "You'll still be living in it." That's when the dread began. It wasn't a loud fear. It crept in slowly, like fog under a door. I don't want to think ill of my son. I don't want to imagine that my own flesh and blood would try to trick me. But something about the way he said it, "You'll still be living in it," made my stomach turn. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat in the den with Loretta's photo and whispered, "What if they're trying to take it from me?" This house is more than timber and nails. It's the place where we raised our child, where Loretta baked pies and scolded me for not fixing the gutters, where we laughed and fought and grew old together. To give it up, no, to be tricked into giving it up, would be a betrayal of everything I've worked for, of everything I've endured. I don't know what they're planning. But I do know this. I won't go quietly. I won't sign anything until I know exactly what it is. And maybe, just maybe, I'll ask someone to be here with me on Saturday. Not for protection, for truth. Because if this is what I think it is, I'm going to need a witness. They arrived late in the morning, just as the September sun had started to warm the porch swing where I'd been dozing off with a book open on my chest. I'd been up since 5, nerves keeping me from sleep, and I had put on my best shirt, the one Loretta used to iron just right before Sunday service. I even trimmed my beard, cleaned the glass on all the picture frames in the living room, and set out the good coasters. Ridiculous, I know, but some part of me hoped this wasn't what I feared. That maybe, just maybe, they were just visiting. Just talking, just remembering they had a father. But the moment their silver SUV pulled into the driveway and I saw Richard in his tailored navy blazer and Lindsay with her sharp white blouse and tablet case, I knew it wasn't a social call. They looked like business people coming to make a pitch, not a son and daughter-in-law visiting a lonely old man. Richard barely glanced at the marigolds I'd just watered along the path. He used to help me plant them every spring. Now he stepped over a trowel I'd left beside the porch without even noticing. Lindsay smiled too wide, said, "Clarence, look at you. You're looking well," and leaned in for an air kiss that never quite touched my cheek. I nodded, stepped aside, let them into my home. Richard moved like he owned the place, went straight to the dining room and set down his brown leather folder like it was an auctioneer's gavel. "Dad," he said, voice brisk, "this won't take long. Just a couple of things we'd like to go over with you, that's all." I stood behind the chair where Loretta used to sit, hands gripping the backrest, and asked plainly, "Is this about the house?" Lindsay exchanged a glance with Richard, then gave me that condescending half-smile people reserve for old men who ask inconvenient questions. "It's just a matter of making sure things are clear, Dad," Richard said. "It's for your protection, really. We've been looking into ways to avoid complications, tax-wise, legally, when, the time comes." I didn't respond. I watched as Lindsay pulled out a packet of papers neatly clipped together and began laying them out on the table. "It's called a transfer on death deed," she said, tapping a heading. "Totally legal, and totally standard. You remain the owner, and when the time comes, no probate, no mess, just a clean, efficient transition." I said nothing. She went on, "You'd still live here, of course. Nothing would change in your day-to-day. But, technically, the title would pass directly to Richard, which makes things so much easier for everyone. You'd be doing us all a big favor." I asked, "Is there a rush?" Richard shook his head quickly. No, not at all. But we thought it best to do this while everything's still in good order. While you're still sharp." The way he said it, like a ticking clock, made me flinch. I reached for the top sheet and began to read, slowly, methodically. Lindsay cleared her throat. "Don't worry about the legal jargon, Clarence. It's boilerplate." Our attorney looked everything over. "I'd like someone of my own to look at it too," I said. That's when Richard's tone shifted. "Dad, it's not like we're asking you to sign away your rights. It's just a formality, and you're not exactly... Well, you've said yourself that paperwork stresses you out. We thought we'd help you with it." I looked at my son, my only child, and saw in his face not concern, not patience, but calculation. He wasn't asking. He was pushing, carefully, politely, but pushing all the same. And behind his words was the unmistakable assumption that I was slipping, fading, too old to notice a trap even if it was set in daylight. That's when I knew. This wasn't for my benefit. This wasn't protection. This was positioning. Still, I kept my voice level. "I'm not signing anything today." Lindsay blinked in surprise. "But Clarence, it's already been notarized in part. Our notary witnessed Richard's signature. All it needs now is yours." I let that sit for a moment. "You already signed?" Richard nodded. "Yes, to streamline things. It's common. But again, no pressure. We just wanted to walk through it with you." I could feel the blood rising to my face. Not from anger yet, but from the sharp betrayal of being maneuvered like this in my own home. I said I'm not signing today. Lindsay's lips pressed into a thin line. Richard gathered the papers into a tidy stack again, slower this time. "Okay, fine. You want to take some time. That's perfectly fine. But Dad, we really hope you'll come to see this is best for everyone. You wouldn't want this house to get tied up in court when the time comes. It's a legacy. We want to preserve that." "You mean you want to control that?" I said, not loud but clearly. They stayed another 10 minutes, chatting about meaningless things. How the girls were doing in school, how the housing market was shifting. But I barely heard them. I was already thinking ahead, running through names in my mind, remembering that Terry Hopkins, one of my old students from the class of '83, had gone into law. He'd sent me a Christmas card last year with his firm's logo embossed in gold. I still had it tucked into the drawer by the phone. When they finally left, Lindsay said, "We'll check in next week, Clarence. Let us know if you have any questions." Richard leaned in, patted my shoulder, and said, "Think about it, Dad. It really is the smart move." I nodded, watched them walk to their car, and as soon as the door shut behind me, I locked it. I stood there in the quiet for a long while, then went to the drawer, pulled out the card, and stared at the number. Loretta once told me, "Trust doesn't break all at once. It crumbles in corners you don't see until the roof falls in." I wasn't going to let the roof fall in, not this time. The following morning, I called the number on Terry Hopkins' card. His assistant, a brisk-sounding woman named Helen, answered and remembered my name immediately. "Oh, Mr. Monroe. Mr. Hopkins often speaks of you. He said you were the toughest teacher he ever had." I chuckled weakly, flattered, but weary. I explained briefly that I needed advice about a legal matter involving my home and some family pressure. Helen didn't ask unnecessary questions. She scheduled me for an appointment that afternoon. I put on my coat, the one with the frayed lining Loretta used to patch, and caught the 11:10 bus downtown. The city hadn't changed much, but somehow the sidewalks felt steeper, the people faster, the cold air biting more sharply through my sleeves. Terry greeted me in the lobby of his office building, gray-haired now, in a three-piece suit but still carrying the same boyish, nervous energy I remembered from when he used to fidget through history exams. We talked for a minute about old times. He mentioned my lesson on the Gettysburg Address and how it had changed how I thought about dignity, before getting down to business. I handed him the papers Richard and Lindsay had left and told him what they'd said. Terry flipped through them, his face tightening with each page. "Clarence, this isn't a transfer on death deed. This is a full quitclaim transfer. If you sign this, you are surrendering all legal interest in the house. You won't own anything anymore. It'll belong solely to your son. You'd have no right to remain here unless they permit it in writing, and even that can be revoked." I sat back in the chair, hands gripping the armrests. The room seemed to tip slightly, like the air had become denser. "But they told me." "They lied," Terry said bluntly. "Or they assumed you wouldn't read it carefully. Either way, it's no mistake. This is intentional. They are trying to trick you into giving up your home." For a long time, I said nothing. I looked out the window at the gray sky, the rooftops dusted with early leaves, and I felt something shift inside me. Not quite rage, not yet, but a deep, cold indignation that settled in my bones like winter. "What can I do?" I asked finally. Terry leaned forward. "First, you do not sign anything else. Second, you keep those documents safe. Third, you allow me to document everything you've told me so far. And fourth, if you're willing, I'd like to be present the next time they try something like this, as your legal witness." I agreed without hesitation. Something had turned. I wasn't scared anymore. I was focused. Over the next few days, I began noticing other things, small but sharp. Richard called every evening now, asking how I was, reminding me about the important documents, repeating the phrase, "It's just a formality." So often it sounded rehearsed. "Lindsay sent over a box of protein shakes and vitamins to help you stay strong, Clarence," along with a digital pillbox programmed with alarms. At first I thought it was just more condescension. Then I realized these weren't gifts. These were props, tools for a narrative they were trying to build. A helpless old man, mentally slipping, physically deteriorating, clinging to a property he could no longer manage. I started to feel watched. One afternoon, a social worker showed up unannounced. A woman in her 40s, too cheerful, who said she was just checking in, because she'd received a call expressing concern about an elderly resident possibly in decline. I invited her in, served coffee, answered all her questions calmly and clearly. When she left, she looked vaguely embarrassed. "You seem quite sharp, Mr. Monroe." I nodded. "Sharp enough to know when someone wants me out of my own house." That night I called Terry again and told him everything. He wasn't surprised. "They're laying groundwork," he said, "trying to establish a record. If they can prove you're mentally unfit, they can petition the court to assume guardianship. Once that happens, they can do whatever they want with your property. This isn't just greedy, it's strategic." That same week, Richard and Lindsay returned, uninvited. They brought takeout, Thai food, which they know I can't digest, and fake smiles. "We thought it'd be nice to have a little dinner together, just the three of us," Lindsay said, opening containers, her eyes scanning the living room like she was inventorying the furniture. I played along. I even pretended to forget the name of the dish I used to love, just to see how quickly they'd pounce. Sure enough, Richard leaned in, nodding sympathetically. "It's okay, Dad. We all have those moments. Nothing to worry about." After dinner, he brought out a new document, supposedly simplified, with more protective clauses. I asked if their attorney had prepared it. Lindsay said yes. "But we can explain it. It's really very basic." I smiled. "I'd like my own counsel to take a look." They stiffened. "Who?" Richard asked. "Terry Hopkins," I said. "Remember him? You met him once when he was just a teenager. He's an attorney now. Very sharp." There was a pause, the kind that hums with hidden electricity. "Of course," Richard said finally, voice tight. "We didn't realize you'd spoken to someone." "Well," I said, rising from the table, "it's a big decision, isn't it? I wouldn't want to sign away the home I built without understanding every word." Lindsay began to collect the takeout boxes in silence, her lips pressed thin. Richard stood too, but not before saying, "Dad, you know we're just trying to help. This is all for your protection." "And I appreciate that," I said, "so I'm sure you'll understand if I protect myself too." I closed the door behind them and locked it. Later that night, I noticed that a drawer in my study had been disturbed, the one where I keep the deed, the will, and my old checkbooks. Nothing taken, but things were shuffled. I didn't sleep. I sat in my chair by the fireplace until the first light of dawn. Something had started, and it wasn't going to stop until I ended it. It was the second Sunday of October when the illusion cracked wide open. The air had started to turn, that unmistakable chill crawling in through the window frames reminding me to haul the storm windows from the basement. I'd just come back from a short walk, my morning ritual since Loretta passed, a slow circle around the block that gave my knees something to complain about and my lungs a brief conversation with fresh air, when I found a certified letter in the mailbox. It was from a medical practice I'd never visited, a doctor. Stanton of Glenridge Neurological Associates, addressed directly to me but with a strange line underneath. Per request of family representative. My hands began to tremble even before I opened it. Inside, a printed evaluation summary. It stated I had recently undergone a preliminary cognitive screening, which suggested mild cognitive impairment consistent with early-onset dementia, and recommended guardianship evaluation in the interest of the patient's long-term care and safety. I sat down on the front steps and read the letter again, and again. My mouth went dry. I hadn't been to any such clinic. I hadn't spoken to any doctor named Stanton. This was fabrication, an outright lie, and someone with my last name, had made that lie official. I called Terry immediately. He asked me to scan and email the letter, which I did after fumbling with the dusty old printer Loretta had once insisted on keeping, just in case. 20 minutes later, he called me back, his voice tight and deliberate. "They're moving fast," he said. "This is an orchestrated attempt to establish that you are mentally unfit to manage your affairs. This evaluation was submitted without your knowledge, which is unethical if not outright illegal. But here's the real kicker. This doctor, Stanton, is an old college friend of Lindsay's. Their name came up on LinkedIn, buried deep in connections. It's a networked favor." I felt a fire begin to crawl up my spine. The betrayal had gone from passive to tactical. This wasn't neglect. This was war. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were building the legal groundwork to erase me while I was still alive. Terry advised we preempt any legal filings by demanding an independent medical examination conducted through court-certified experts. He had already drafted the paperwork. I would undergo a full capacity evaluation. Neurological, psychological, cognitive. "You'll pass it," he said, "and once you do, we can submit it to block any petition they try to file. But, Clarence, you need to be ready. They're going to escalate. They don't know you've seen this letter yet. That gives us a slight advantage. Don't confront them just yet." But waiting wasn't easy. Every corner of the house began to feel like it was under surveillance. I moved the deed and my passport into a lockbox and placed it in the garage under the water heater just in case. I began to carry a notepad in my shirt pocket where I documented every call, every message, every odd incident. I also started recording phone conversations. Legally, Iowa is a one-party consent state, and it was during one of these calls, a routine just checking in from Richard, that I captured it. He asked, casually, if I was feeling foggy lately. I said I wasn't. Then he said, "You know, sometimes it's hard to tell when it starts. Lindsay says you seemed off last time we visited. Just little things. You repeated yourself. You forgot your pills. I mean, nothing serious, but we worry, you know?" And I said, very carefully, "Yes, I remember that visit. I remember you asking me to sign something. I remember Lindsay taking photos of the medicine cabinet." There was a pause, a beat of silence. Then, uncharacteristically sharply, he said, "Well, it's better to have safeguards in place before things get worse." That night I replayed the recording 5 times. His voice, smooth, calculated, sounded so foreign. This was my son, my only son, and he was speaking about me like I was a patient in a facility, like I was already somewhere else. They had already mentally buried me. The next day, I underwent the court-certified evaluation. 3 separate specialists over the course of 5 hours, each one polite, thorough, and clearly surprised when I recited dates, solved patterns, reconstructed memory sequences. I even slipped in details about the Cuban Missile Crisis to one of them, just to show I wasn't just sharp, I was still the man who once taught American history without notes. 2 days later, Terry called with the results. "You passed with flying colors. All 3 signed affidavits of full capacity. We're submitting them immediately." I felt something inside me steady. The ground under my feet felt solid again. But the relief was brief. Because now I knew the depth of what Richard and Lindsay were willing to do. They had already written the obituary of my competence. They were not going to stop. And now they were going to find out that neither would I. The week after my cognitive evaluation was filed marked the beginning of a new kind of silence in my life. Not the natural quiet of a widower's house, but the sharp, humming silence of people who have been caught in a lie and are scrambling behind. The curtain. I heard nothing from Richard or Lindsay for 5 days. No calls, no drop-ins, not even one of Lindsay's breezy, faux-concerned emails. It was eerie, as if they had paused, recalculating their strategy, or perhaps expecting me to call first and explain myself, to offer a reasonable compromise, like a man who realizes he's pushing back against inevitability. But I didn't call. I stayed still and alert, like an animal that knows a predator hasn't gone far, only out of sight. On the 6th day, I received an envelope slid through the front door. Not mailed, not delivered, just placed there quietly sometime in the night. Inside was another set of documents, this time titled Medical Support and Property Security Authorization, which I recognized immediately as a veiled attempt at granting power of attorney. Along with it was a short handwritten note from Richard. "Dad, we're really worried. This is just to help us help you. Please don't make this harder than it has to be. R." No salutation, no warmth, just a warning dressed in concern. That was the moment I knew they weren't retreating. They were repositioning. Terry reviewed the documents and confirmed my suspicion. "This would allow them to make financial and medical decisions on your behalf. It's a backdoor guardianship. If you sign this, Clarence, they own your future. They can sell your house, move you to assisted living, manage your bank accounts, everything. It's a legal muzzle." I asked him if we should respond. "Not yet," he said. "Let them show their hand fully. You've already blocked their first strategy. Now they're pushing the second. But if we hold and collect and document, we'll be in position to reverse the pressure. But you have to keep your eyes open." I nodded, but inside I was already somewhere else. Inside every conversation, every glance I had overlooked over the past year, reading it all with fresh clarity. The dots began to connect in dark patterns. The way Richard had insisted on setting up online banking for me, saying, "It's just easier for me to help you this way." The way Lindsay had asked to store documents in my attic for safe keeping, and how. Since then, she always had some excuse to access it alone when she visited. The comments about how big the house was, how hard it must be to keep up. The gradual erosion of my autonomy cloaked in helpfulness. And I saw, with gut-turning certainty, that this hadn't started suddenly. It had been building for years, quietly, like mold behind a wall. A few days later, my landline rang at an unusual hour, 8:47 p.m. Richard's voice was heavy, urgent. "Dad, I don't know why you're being so stubborn. Lindsay and I just want to help. You're making things unnecessarily difficult. This paranoia. It's not you. I told him calmly that I had passed the court-certified cognitive evaluation and that his attempts to have me declared incompetent were on record. There was a long silence on the line. "You hired a lawyer?" he said finally. "You really think you need legal protection from your own son?" I answered, "Yes. Yes, I do." His voice dropped, quieter now, but colder. "You're making a mistake. You think this is strength, but it's just pride. And pride is going to leave you alone, Clarence. When you need help, no one will be there." Then he hung up. That night, I sat by the window with Loretta's picture, the same way I had after her funeral. But this time, I didn't feel grief. I felt clarity, and, underneath it, resolve. I wasn't going to wait for them to try again. I was going to take the next step. Terry and I began preparing a formal revocation of any existing shared financial accounts and access permissions. I had one joint account that had sat mostly dormant, a relic from when Richard was in college and I'd used it to deposit tuition money. I never closed it. Why would I? It had been easier to keep it active, and besides, there was rarely more than a few $100s in it. But when we checked, we found that in the past 6 months, Richard had transferred over $12,000 through that account, money that had passed through my savings without my knowledge. "He's been moving money through you to make it look like gifts," Terry said. "If we dig further, we might find more." I signed the closure documents that afternoon and moved the remaining funds into a private account under my exclusive control. I also changed my will, locking down my estate and assigning Terry as the legal executor, removing Richard's discretionary powers. It was a brutal thing to do, a decision no parent should ever be forced to make. But I had to. I could no longer assume that blood was a bond, not when it had been used to cut so deeply. Then came the visit, a surprise as always. I had just returned from a follow-up doctor's appointment when I saw their car in the driveway. They were already on the porch. Richard looked drawn, older, like the strain of concealment had begun to show. Lindsay, however, looked alert, narrow-eyed, lips tight, like someone conducting a negotiation. "We need to talk," Richard said without greeting. I let them in, but didn't offer coffee. Lindsay sat down and began without pleasantries. "We understand you've been consulting with an attorney. That's your right, but it's also incredibly hurtful. We feel like you're accusing us of something terrible." I responded, "You forged a medical evaluation. You tried to move money without my consent. You pushed documents in front of me that would remove my ownership of this home. Tell me, Lindsay, what exactly am I misinterpreting?" She flinched, but only slightly. "We were trying to protect you. You've been confused. You forgot your medications." I reached into the drawer and placed a printed transcript of the court-certified evaluation in front of her. "The court disagrees." Richard stood up, pacing now, agitated. "You're acting like we're criminals. We're your family. We love you. But you're making it impossible to trust that you're thinking clearly." I answered, "What you mean is, I'm not agreeing to hand everything over, so I must be delusional." He stopped, turned to me and said something that would echo in my mind for weeks. "We didn't want it to come to this, Dad. But if you keep resisting, we may have no choice." That night I called Terry and told him everything. He didn't hesitate. "It's time to move forward," he said. "They've overplayed their hand. You now have evidence of manipulation, coercion, financial misconduct, and medical fraud. If you're willing, Clarence, I think it's time we initiate legal proceedings not just to block them, but to protect your estate from further harm." I agreed. Not with joy, not with vengeance, but with the grim understanding that love does not immunize against greed, and that sometimes the hardest justice to pursue is the one that splits a family. The day of the hearing came colder than expected. Gray clouds dragging over the sky like heavy fabric, and the wind biting with the kind of spiteful sharpness that made my knees ache. I dressed with care that morning, putting on the same charcoal suit I had worn to Loretta's memorial service, not because it carried any symbolic weight, but because it was the last suit I owned that still fit. I combed my thinning hair back, tightened my tie with shaking fingers, and tucked into my breast pocket a single folded photograph. Me and Loretta on our front porch, the house behind us, her hand on my shoulder, my hand over hers. It was the first summer after we'd paid off the mortgage, and we looked happy in that kind of solid, enduring way that only comes when both people know they've built something together. That house was not just mine. It was ours, and now, years after burying her, I was walking into a courtroom to stop my son from burying me. Terry met me at the courthouse steps. He looked more tense than usual, eyes flicking over his notes, brow furrowed. "You ready?" he asked. "Yes," I said, and tired of pretending not to be. The hearing wasn't a criminal case, but the stakes felt just as grave. This was about control, about ownership, about dignity. Richard and Lindsay were already seated when we entered. Their lawyer, some young, polished man with the kind of practiced empathy you learn in corporate litigation, whispering something into Lindsay's ear as she nodded and avoided my eyes. Richard looked pale. His confidence had curdled into something sour, nervous, defensive. When the judge entered, we stood, and the formality of it all settled over the room like a veil. This wasn't a family dispute. This was a reckoning. Their lawyer began first, outlining what he called a deeply unfortunate family miscommunication, emphasizing concern, care, and a sincere desire to ensure Mr. Monroe's well-being. He cited incidents, conveniently vague, of confusion, alleged memory lapses, and behavioral changes. He produced the forged letter from Dr. Stanton as supporting documentation. That was their opening salvo. Then it was our turn. Terry stood, and his voice changed. No longer warm, but surgical. He presented the results of my certified cognitive evaluation, the detailed affidavits of the doctors who had examined me, the timeline of Richard and Lindsay's contact, the financial transactions, the unauthorized access to my joint account, the photographs Lindsay had taken of my medicine cabinet, and finally the recording I had made of Richard's call. Every word was played in the courtroom, Richard's voice echoing through the speakers. "You're making a mistake. Pride will leave you alone. We may have no choice." The courtroom didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The weight of it settled over everyone like a verdict already spoken. The judge leaned forward and asked me directly, "Mr. Monroe, do you believe your son and daughter-in-law are acting in your best interest?" I looked at Richard then, really looked at him, not as a lawyer might or a plaintiff, but as a father. I saw the boy who once scraped his knee on the driveway and ran to me crying. I saw the teenager who used to close his bedroom door so hard the whole house shook. And I saw the man who now sat there, flushed, ashamed, still trying to disguise greed as love. I answered simply, "No, Your Honor, I believe they are acting in their own." The judge nodded once and closed the folder in front of her. This court sees no evidence of incapacity or incompetence. On the contrary, Mr. Monroe demonstrates not only cognitive clarity but remarkable diligence in protecting his rights. The petition for guardianship is denied. Furthermore, the submission of falsified medical records will be forwarded to the licensing board for further investigation. This hearing is concluded. There was no applause, no cinematic swell. Just the sound of chairs scraping as people stood and the shuffling hush of consequences taking shape. Richard stood slowly. Lindsay was already moving toward the exit, her face blank and unreadable. I didn't follow them. I didn't speak. I stayed by my chair until the room had emptied and Terry put a hand on my shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. But he was wrong. It wasn't over. It had only just turned. In the days that followed the hearing, the house felt different. not lighter, not exactly, but steadier, as though its foundation had absorbed the truth of what had happened and settled into a new kind of silence. Not the bitter hush of suspicion, but the sober quiet of recovery. I walked from room to room, not to search for anything, but simply to be present again, to reclaim the walls, the floors, the very air that for months had felt like it belonged to someone else's idea of me. I opened windows and let the October air drift through, cold but clean, sweeping away whatever was left of the fear I had carried, the fear of being erased by the very people I had raised. The garden was overgrown, the grass a little wild, but I spent a full afternoon trimming, weeding, shaping it back into something recognizable. Not because I cared what the neighbors thought, but because I needed to put my hands back into the earth. That Loretta and I had once tended together. The house, after all, had survived more than schemes. It had survived grief, time, and now betrayal, and it was still standing. So was I. Richard didn't call. Neither did Lindsay. No apology, no explanation, not even a final attempt at salvaging pretense. I imagined them packing up their narratives, retreating into silence, maybe even convincing themselves that I had misunderstood everything, that they had only meant well, that this outcome was somehow unfair. That was their burden to carry. Mine was simpler. I went to the bank and finalized the separation of accounts. I revoked all shared authorizations, updated my will, and sent a notarized letter to their address stating that no future contact regarding my estate would be acknowledged. Not out of cruelty, but closure. The kind of closure that isn't revenge. It's relief. Then I called the city assessor and began the process of placing the house into a living trust, naming a small nonprofit in Loretta's memory as the beneficiary. When I die, it won't be sold for someone else's gain. It'll become a refuge for widowers without family, a place to rest and read and sit in peace. That, I thought, is a better legacy than any inheritance measured in square footage. A week later, I received a letter. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting. Hazel, my granddaughter. I hadn't seen her in 3 years, hadn't spoken to her since she was a junior in high school. The note was brief, but startling in its clarity. Grandpa, I heard about everything. I don't know what to say except that I'm sorry. I don't agree with what they did. If you ever want to talk, I'd like to. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside Loretta's photograph. I didn't call Hazel, not yet. Maybe I will, maybe not. But something in that letter told me that not everything had been lost. That maybe there were roots still holding, somewhere deep, waiting for time and truth to bring them back to life. For now, I wake early, make my coffee the way Loretta taught me, and sit by the window as the sun rises over the quiet street. The marigolds are still blooming, defiant and bright. The birds come and go from the feeder, unaware of the human betrayals they perch above. I'm alone, yes, but not broken. And, more importantly, not fooled. The worst part of betrayal isn't the loss. It's the moment you realize someone thought so little of you. They assumed you wouldn't notice. But I noticed, and I remembered, and I endured. Not out of bitterness, but principle. Because some houses are more than property, and some men, even old ones, are more than paper signatures. I protected what mattered. And in doing so, I found a piece of myself again. The part that new dignity is not something you inherit. It's something you guard, even if it means standing alone. Especially then. There's something strange about the quiet that comes after a battle you never wanted to fight. It doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in, hesitant at first, like even silence needs permission to return to a house that's been filled with so much tension, so many unspoken accusations, so much cold calculation dressed in warm words. For weeks after the hearing, I found myself listening for footsteps that weren't there, for voices outside the door, for the rustling sound of betrayal moving through my home again, like a draft that no weather stripping can block. But none of that came. The silence held, and eventually I began to hear other things. My own breath in the mornings, the kettle beginning to whistle, the rustle of old leaves across the porch steps, the steady ticking of the wall clock Loretta picked out 30 years ago. And in those sounds, I began to remember what it felt like to live, not just to survive or resist, but to exist with some kind of peace again. I didn't realize how much space Richard and Lindsay had occupied in my mind until their absence stretched out wide like a cleared field. For months, every day had carried the weight of preparing for their next move, anticipating it, documenting, remembering, defending. And now, with that weight gone, I was left with something unfamiliar. Not victory, not quite, more like aftermath. I took long walks again, slower than I used to with a cane now, but each step steadier than the last. The neighbors waved a bit more often. Paul, the widower across the street who used to grumble about everything, came over one afternoon with a pie his daughter had baked and sat with me on the porch in unexpected silence. We didn't talk about family. We didn't talk about court. We just watched the birds pick at the feeder and let the light shift on the lawn. And somehow that small act of companionship filled a space that had felt hollow for too long. But healing isn't the same as forgetting. Some mornings I still woke up with the thought that today might be the day Richard calls. Not to apologize. I don't think I expect that anymore. But just to test the line again, to see if the door is still cracked open. It isn't. I know that now. When someone builds a narrative around your demise, when they take quiet steps to erase your autonomy, your identity, your very ownership of your own life, there is no return to what was. There is only what comes after. And in that after, I learned that forgiveness is not always reconciliation. Sometimes it is simply the refusal to let bitterness rot the foundation of who you are. I chose not to be bitter, but I also chose not to be fooled twice. That's a line I've had to draw in permanent ink. I began writing again, something I hadn't done in decades. Not books, nothing grand like that, but letters to Loretta, as if she were still here to read them. I told her everything, from the first conversation where Richard tried to slide those papers under my nose, to the courtroom, to the photo I kept of us on the porch that day, the day we laughed about how long it took to pay off the damn mortgage. I told her how I felt in that final moment when the judge spoke, when Richard's face went pale, when Lindsay's eyes darted away like a child caught in a lie. I told her I wished she had been there to see it, not for the spectacle of it, but for the quiet justice. The justice of being seen, believed, and protected, not by a system or a title, but by truth and preparation. I wrote those letters late at night by the yellow light of the kitchen lamp and folded each one neatly, storing them in a box beside the photo albums. Maybe no one will ever read them. Maybe that's not the point. One day, a week before Thanksgiving, I received a phone call from Hazel again, my granddaughter. I almost didn't answer, but something in me, maybe that same part of me that used to read bedtime stories to Richard even after he said he didn't need them, picked up the receiver. Her voice was hesitant, not the confident cheerfulness I remembered from her childhood, but something softer, more uncertain. She said she'd been thinking about what happened. She didn't defend her parents. She didn't try to explain it away. She just said, "I miss you, Grandpa, and if it's okay, I'd like to visit. Just me." I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch out between us, not as punishment, but as space for truth to breathe. Then I said, "Yes, but only if you come as yourself. Not as their daughter, just as Hazel." She paused, then said, "That's the only way I want to come." And somehow that small promise, simple as it was, meant more than anything I'd heard from family in years. When she arrived the next Saturday, she brought nothing but a small bag and a box of old photos she'd taken from her closet. We sat together in the den, flipping through pictures, laughing at bad haircuts and crooked smiles. She asked about Loretta, about how we met, about what kind of music she liked, and I told her stories I hadn't told in years, stories that made the house feel full again, not of noise or pressure or schemes, but of presence. When she hugged me goodbye that evening, it was without performance, just arms around shoulders, heartbeat to heartbeat. And I thought, this is what survival looks like. Not just resisting harm, but living long enough to reclaim something good again. There will always be scars. I know that. I see them in the drawer I had to install a lock on. I hear them in the tone I use now when anyone asks me about legal papers or property. I feel them in the way I double-check who I trust. But there is also strength in those scars. They remind me I didn't bend, that even when those closest to me plotted to remove me from the life I built, I stood and said, no, not yet. Not like this. That, to me, is worth more than the house, more than the money, more than even the small piece I've carved out in these twilight years. It is the knowledge that I was not erased, that I kept my name, my story, my home. The marigolds out front have started to wilt. The frost will take them soon, as it always does. But I'll plant new ones in the spring, just like Loretta used to. I'll rake the leaves, fix the screen door, make soup in the pot she always used, and keep the photo on the mantel where it belongs. This house will not pass to someone who tried to steal it. It will live its own life after me, just like I continued to live mine after her. And if someday Hazel comes back and asks to sit in the garden again, I'll make sure there's a place for her. Not because she's family, but because she showed up with honesty. And sometimes honesty is enough to start over, even in a house that has already seen too much.